first section, a parable about capitalism. Ah, Bartleby, ah, humanity, exclaims the first-person narrator at the conclusion of Herman Melville's tale of a Scrivener who devolves from perfect employee to self-inflicted starvation in prison after incrementally preferring not to death. For though he initially impresses his employer with his excellent work habits and competence, the Scrivener subsequently refuses to fulfill his obligations, or even to move out of the Wall Street office after the lawyer can no longer tolerate the scorn he attracts for letting the Scrivener persist on the premises while refusing to work. Rather than call the police to have his fired copyist removed, the gentle lawyer moves offices, thus leaving his successor with the burden of managing Bartleby. Following the latter's death, the lawyer's research indicates that Melville's inscrutable titular character previously worked in a dead letter office, a job that mostly involves sorting messages and packages that had never arrived at their destinations, an unbearable and interminable succession of chances to save that were missed, a nadir of futility. Melville's Bartleby the Scrivener, A Story of Wall Street from 1856, features an array of idiosyncratic characters beginning with the first-person narrator, a lawyer who employs turkey, nippers, and ginger nut before initially perfect Bartleby arrives on the scene. Though the narrator claims to admire John Jacob Astor, a name associated with the Protestant work ethic, the former's actions reveal a merciful, generous, and kind-hearted boss who tolerates an absurd level of deficiency from his copyists. As he explains, Turkey works diligently until lunch but is too tipsy to submit decent copies thereafter. Conversely, Nippers is dyspeptic and irritable in the morning. He can only be counted on in the afternoon. Moreover, he entertains less than savory clients, which further detracts from the professional standards his employer would rather uphold. From the two, their employer only manages to extract one full day of labor, while Gingernut periodically fetches the biscuits for which he is named. Noticeable here, of course, is how tolerant the lawyer is, while claiming that he sees himself as safe. He would rather continue to employ Turkey and Nippers than replace them with properly behaved professionals who would respectively give him more than half a day's productivity each. In short, they serve as foils that expose their boss's disposition as someone who ostensibly admires the Protestant work ethic while conspicuously preferring not to wield the coercive force of bossiness as a means of pressuring his staff to meet basic standards. Though Bartleby initially fulfills this standard to his employer's satisfaction, over time he incrementally refuses to carry out his desires by saying, "I prefer not to," whenever the narrator assigns him a task. Upon his death, we are left with the mystery surrounding this pallid, inscrutable, and maddening being who acts as though an overwhelming sense of futility can be exercised through inertia. But it can't, of course. The world won't let up. The lawyer's clients and colleagues are baffled by his mercy. They even look down on him for it. This social pressure enforces a limit to his compassion as he feels driven to escape the situation without inflicting harm. Before his position is deemed obsolete, we learn along with him about what severely depressed and broken down workers can expect from a capitalist society: utter abandonment. In what follows, I will reflect on the abandonment issues that goad some of us trying to counter a neoliberal weaponization of the Protestant work ethics injunction to embrace hard work for its own sake, to prove our membership in the elect. Abandonment, real and figurative, is sometimes experienced as betrayal when those who proclaim their own civility fail or refuse to enact it. Betrayal folds into persistent grievance and ressentiment that generate and exacerbate mental health problems that insinuate themselves into professional ethics and socioeconomic interactions that constitute our neoliberal mean world. The affective economies attending the extraction of absolute surplus value at Waffen University. Second section. Mean world and neoliberalism as such. One distinctive feature of neoliberalism is that it downloads recovery onto patients and job costs onto employees. In Edmonton, it also manifests itself in the failure to clear roads in neighborhoods of ice and snow, leaving most of us with dangerous conditions unless we are able to pay for a road clearing service. Since the financial crisis, neoliberal values have exponentially intensified as a generation of employees found decent paying and stable work increasingly scarce, and at many universities, hiring was frozen while gig economies proliferated. The result is that subsequent generations have been interpolated into a 24/7 spatiotemporality that goads them to be on call for their bosses and or clients at all hours, to show initiative by volunteering for extra work, and to be entrepreneurial by self-promoting and spearheading initiatives, which is a phrase I think I found in our annual report. Another name for this mean world mentality is the Protestant, what Caball calls the Protestant work ethic on steroids, with 2 exclamation marks, maybe 2.5. And it is most self-evident. As a refraction of MAGA toxicity, and as the modus operandi of the death-driven political economy, whereby those increasingly left behind and precarious and denigrated focus their rage on the others whom so-called cultural elites and feminist witches above all seek to protect. So LGBTQ+, BIPOCs, immigrants, women, DEI mandates, and so-called critical race theory. And I say so-called because the people who usually bash it don't know what it is. So. It's an affective economy where survival anxiety visceralizes other bashing entitlements. So this section is called Waffen SS University as Mean World, Alienated, here's Caball math. Okay, so alienated exhaustion is greater than presence of mind. That's the first Caball equation in the field of Caball math. Okay. All right, so it begins with the downloading of labor costs onto the employee, parking, some essential healthcare costs like glasses, computers, and conferences. Most, if not all of those things are job requirements. But what other universities force their faculty to pay for their own computers? UBC covers at least a couple of conferences per year. Yet at Waffen SS University, we have to apply for grants to cover these costs. And the internal grant criteria are sometimes impasses. Thus, if I am a pianist seeking SAS funding to travel to a performance venue, I have to demonstrate how this aim reflects DEI values. Though I am in nearly every other situation supportive of DEI, in this instance it is irrelevant while nevertheless being used as a cudgel. Okay. Mean World weaponizes the ethic of self-sacrifice while rationalizing the downloading of professional costs onto employees. Mentoring is like mothering. It is absolutely necessary labor that is fiercely demanded while being taken for granted. If I do not enthusiastically and happily engage in self-sacrifice regardless of compensation, then I am a nader of moral turpitude, exclamation point. No cost of living increases equals lower salaries over time. This is where absolute surplus labor kicks in. If our workload expands at the same time, our ostensibly non-negotiable service loads, for example, then we are witnessing textbook examples of Marx's theory of absolute surplus value. How do we prefer not to accept this extraction? The word non-negotiable, I was kind of wondering if my other colleagues got this from their chairs, if it was in the emails that all went out to all of us about how many hours our service loads are per year, if everyone heard the word non-negotiable, or if that was just in our department.
I refuse to read that email, so I don't know.
Okay, yeah, non-negotiable was in our emails. I suspect it was added in 2 emails that we received about things that we're supposed to do, because we're children. Another conspicuous mirror of the hegemonically entrenched discipline of the market and the mean world mentality it precipitates is our annual reports, which goad us to identify what initiatives we have spearheaded and affirm a quantity of atomistically produced, derivative, low intellect, and insight-light work at the expense of substantive, original, well-written, and insightful work. Harkening back to a less weaponized understanding of the term profession in academia, mentoring should be valued as much or more than administration, which, based on pay scales, is nonetheless much more highly remunerated at this university, thereby privileging managerial styles, lateral thinking, and single-mindedness for completing successions of tasks that more properly belong to a job description for a corporative administrative assistant in another profession. Suffice to say that my master's and PhD in comparative studies and discourse in society and another in creative writing did not involve managerial and corporate secretary training. Furthermore, because the time and energy of mentoring might deplete our productive quantities, it is devalued and de facto punished at FEC. Most importantly, the Protestant work ethic on steroids, value system, which weaponizes the non-fungible generosity of our profession against us, promotes a stressful expansion of multitasking and an attendant cognitive load that exceeds indexical K-Ball's presence of mind and efficacy, but also corrodes mental and physical health. Another repercussion of an excessive workload is the depletion of the emotional energy and mindfulness required for compassion. The more exhausted and irritable we are, the more internally hardened, transactional, and effectively compartmentalizing we become. One potential result is that we might be less likely to offer to help a colleague who has become seriously ill or injured, or to reach out to someone who has lost a couple of neighborhoods to fire in Los Angeles, to care about, let alone protest, the laundering of Waffen SS funds at the University of Alberta, or to respond kindly to students suffering from major upheavals, including genocide. Okay, here's another section, Little Eichmanns, toward a new categorical imperative. The subject who succeeds in Mean World is the Little Eichmann, a neoliberal vehicle of Hannah Arendt's banality of evil in a minor vein. Versions of Kant's categorical imperative are distinguished by the universalizability principle, in which one should act only in accordance with that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it become a universal law. In lay terms, this simply means that if one undertakes an action, then everyone else should be able to as well. And let's see, that's the website I got that from. It's a Columbia University website. One way of understanding Arendt's criticism of Adolf Eichmann's thoughtlessness is that while he could, to her astonishment, correctly recite a version of Kant's categorical imperative, in practice, he actually substituted the Führer's will for the unconditionally binding rationality that requires setting aside an individual's natural desires for the sake of universal applicability. Even when, toward the end of the Second World War, Heinrich Himmler himself endeavored to end the program of mass murdering Europe's Jews, thinking it would buy him mercy from the victors, Eichmann persisted in facilitating the final solution as an expression of the Führer's will. In effect, Eichmann's categorical imperative was enacted as a disinterested and thus principled commitment to the mass murdering cause, a loyalty that he somehow conflated with nobility. The Little Eichmanns among our administrative staff, faculty, and administrators substitute a neoliberal work ethic for the Führer's will. Waffen SS University's neoliberal Protestant work ethic on steroids, generates a particular kind of subject, the mean-spirited Puritan, who both naturalizes, moralizes, and weaponizes exploitative excesses and corporate behaviors as the way things are. Little Eichmanns treat overwork and infinite generosity as a universal professional standard that all can and must always fulfill. They enjoy using words such as non-negotiable when they inform us that we are expected to devote 365 hours a year to service. I don't remember what the exact number is, because they relish the occasion to sharpen the ineluctability of absolute surplus value extraction. By extension, this goes into another project of mine, which is sadomasochism in everyday life. By extension, if I cannot complete my multifarious deadline tasks despite working 7 days a week, I deserve to be denigrated at the very least and perhaps punished. If I have any physical or mental health problems, including mortality, that undermine my ability to continuously and exponentially multitask, then I can resolve whatever limitations I have, which are always already finite and or somehow my fault, with a medication, a new pair of glasses, or genetic reprogramming. More importantly, an indefinitely painful catastrophe, like suddenly losing the ability to walk, can be finitely resolved with a wheelchair and an attitude change on my part. If my classroom is inaccessible, then why can't I crawl to class? Okay, there's another section called, "Didn't you get my email?" Is to make sure you hear the good tone. "Didn't you get my email?" Cognitive, we already have that one up. Cognitive load, alienated exhaustion, presence of mind, but we can add another one, cognitive load. Okay. So cognitive load, my cognitive load exceeds my presence of mind. Any lapses that take place because cataract K-ball missed or forgot the details of an email are punishable, at the very least with a reproachful tone of voice, which imparts toxins into our affective economy. Naturally, of course, while my emails and demands on my attention increase, aging K-ball's presence of mind at some point will not stretch to accommodate them. I thereby reach a moment when my presence of mind is exceeded by my cognitive load, the algorithm of information entropy, as a version of Kant's mathematical sublime, whereby my apprehension exceeds my comprehension. The more information I'm expected to absorb, remember, and act on, the more my energy is being consumed by processing a barrage of demands, and the less effective and more demoralized I consequently become. Okay. Conclusions. I prefer not to. I prefer not to is another way of saying enough is enough, or in our cases, too much is already more than enough. To the sadomasochistic Puritans who devote meeting time to the question of which among our colleagues is not working hard enough, to the reified compartmentalizers who stubbornly and repeatedly fail to give tragedies and catastrophes their ontological weight and to respond appropriately, to the turgidly ambitious disciples of market discipline who viciously castigate aging coworkers and underlings for forgetting details from one email in 1,000 or the time of a meeting, to the cruel optimists who demand resiliency from the traumatized, bullied, and isolated among us already deteriorating from a dearth of solace and solidarity, to the insular monogamists who are always already unreflectively ensconced in the overwhelming fullness of your self-interested, generally fixated solidarity and co-survival circuits of marriage and children, or what I call zones of interest, to the pedantic solipsists who leave the disabled to drift beyond the back of the herd, and then lecture us for your guilt in refusing to notice or slow down because you were internally calcified and caught up in your immediacies. To the slyly mean little wasps who imperially dictated the protocols of performing genteel whiteness in a genocidal British dominion, while discounting aggression against minorities as particular or merely anecdotal. To the whiny little weenies who tell me what to do, to all of these little Eichmanns at Waffen SS University, I not only channel Bartleby's I prefer not to, but also a categorically imperative fuck off. I actually just had a question for our first presenter. I'm sorry, I don't, what?
Aiden.
Okay. I was excited about your presentation because I just finished a special issue of a journal on susceptibilities or susceptible subjects. And one of the things that inspired me to think about susceptibility as a concept and as supposedly the trait of a subject is the way that debates about trans kids always end up constructing instructors as seducers and kids as susceptible. And so it has a lot of implications, I'd say, legally as well as social policies. And I noticed that you were talking about vulnerability. So it has a paradoxical valence because on the one hand, yeah, we might think of kids as being susceptible or vulnerable in particular ways, but at the same time, the notion of their susceptibility is being weaponized against their identifications as trans.
Yeah, the vulnerability that we engage with or understand children as being, does come from a very, and I'm going to get very discourse analysis heavy on this. It's a construction that is created off of a standard of childhood that is built off of so many isms and phobias and all that. With the purpose of trying to construct particular kinds of adults in the future. I'm sorry, was there a question?
Well, it's just, it's a question of how to navigate this paradox, which is that, or this, the fact that susceptibility is something that we seem to agree about, and yet at the same time it gets weaponized as a reason why children are getting seduced into gender fluidity.
Yeah, it's a tough balancing act to try and strike. I mean, what I always kind of come back to is grounding in reality, as best as we can, because, I am traditionally a discourse analysis, so nothing is real. But the reality is that the susceptibility that children do face, or the vulnerabilities that children do face, again, often come from within the family. The highest rates of child sexual abuse happen within family systems, against within the nuclear family or with somebody that the nuclear family has decided they could trust. And so the kind of vulnerability that we have to protect children as a class against is political, not necessarily identitarian, to use a fancy word for that. As well, the kind of guiding thought that I always have is, yes, children are susceptible to certain ideas, to certain ways of beliefs, to getting their development affected in certain ways, but that is also adults. Adults are just as susceptible to many ideas, to many ideologies, to many regimes and ideas. And so the task isn't necessarily to protect children from bad ideas, but to, in a relational way, kind of understand where ideas are coming from so that they can make informed decisions for themselves and have the power to make informed decisions for themselves about their lives and what they want to do with their lives and how they want to contribute to the world. It's kind of my best response to that. It is tricky though, it's very tricky, especially when there's so few communities who even seriously, that take youth liberation seriously, to be able to discuss these things and figure out back and forth how do we move through this as a culture.
Question and a comment for Aiden, so thanks a lot. You put a lot together in there, And so I'm interested in the history of some of that. So, like, you're talking about contemporary ideas about trans youth, but then your theoretical stuff is quite a bit older. So I had a book I was wondering if you had heard of and thought about, because one of the things about youth movements is the rest of us don't always hear much from them that isn't mediated by someone. And this is by Sean DeLear, I Could Not Believe It, which is his diary from the 70s about being a black gay young guy trying to be like a cool cruising kind of guy, but he's a gawky teen in LA in the 1970s, which is pretty much the seventh circle of hell for somebody like that at that point. And he carried that diary around with him for years after he became a drag performer. And then when he died, he had a friend find it and publish it, right? So I bought it at City Lights. I don't think most people have read this. And I'm wondering, I don't think you would have heard of it, but like, do you have some other things in your project that are about what trans youth and other youth who are, whether they're allies or not, have to say about themselves?
Julie, what's the title?
Pardon me?
The title of the book.
I could not believe it, which is what he starts every entry. And he's like
I would
16.
rather not to.
He's like, oh my God, I could not believe it, that guy's cock was so big. Yeah, but anyways, I would love to hear like from you about like what happens, because I'm in life writing studies, so people like talk a lot in the youth end. There's a lot of youth theorists in that part of the world. I know in your part not so much, but that part where they talk a lot about what kids and youth say. So I'm interested in what you think and what you've heard.
Yeah, so forums and media where youth are able to speak for themselves.
Yeah,
So
if they want. They might prefer not to.
Yeah, so I haven't actually found much, so that's a really important resource that I will be diving into. One of the best sources that I could find is still mediated by an adult researcher, but a PhD dissertation written by Amy Glaser at University of North Carolina. And her dissertation work was working on a community organization with youth leadership. So it was a co-run organization of youth and adults together. They had this organizing committee made up of both, and the kind of struggles that come with trying to help youth speak for themselves when they're trained so much not to speak for themselves, especially in the presence of adults. And that is unfortunately a common issue that comes with youth organizing, that in turn means that their ideas and their organizing and their political activism doesn't reach academia, because this is a very adult-dominated institution naturally as a fixture. There are other organizations. I'm thinking of Youth Liberation Now, I think is a semi-global organization. A lot of their stuff that I've only been able to find online, but they coordinate certain protests. Some of the movements in history included the Gay Liberation Youth Movement. Their documents are online for free. And the Youth Liberation, the original, quote unquote, original Youth Liberation organization that emerged in 1970 with their 15-point platform. They tried to get one of their members, a 15-year-old girl, onto I believe she was trying to get elected to Board of Governors for a school system. And that was how they kind of emerged, where their activism emerged. So some of those primary sources, but it is something that I am constantly trying to seek out more, unfortunately, and it's difficult to find.
Yeah, so I'm going to encourage you to go check out some of the Life Writing Scholarship, because they really are dedicated to talking about what people under the age of whatever you think youth is, right? Because I'm not sure, like whatever that is, right?
Yeah.
But also about the youth young people who were involved in the liberation movements in the 1960s. And here I'm thinking of China, France, the United States, other places that were connected to 1968, and especially China, because those things can be found. So I really wish you well on that.
Thank you.
I have a question for Tanya, even though we discuss it all the time. Her thesis. Is there a way to think of glamour as getting more and more political?
Is there a way
through this? What you've been thinking. I mean, the J-Lo performance, and at the time of the league, a critical time of fascism. Is glamour? I mean, and conversely, is there a fascist glamour?
Yeah.
I'm asking a rhetorical question.
I mean, I'm saying, glamour as a discipline or a medium of protest is one of those mass cultural, like we're talking mass cultural art form, hypervisibility, but I can't deliver it and say it always uses its power for good. I think like someone mentioned, the image of the Nazi wife trying on fur coats of the dead.
So that's glamour.
Yeah, it's glamour, right? Like it's definitely a contested art form, but I find what compels me to really think of it as a political art form, as politically engaged, is because it's so, it's often taken up by a lot of glamour as a medium by women and LGBTQ members, by queer folks and women, by marginalized groups. And there's this tendency to be really dismissive about it. It's cultural fluff, you know, these pop divas, they don't have anything to contribute, they're not intelligent, their performances are just, you know, that's some sort of excess and indulgency. But I think it's actually, I actually argue, I go back, well, wait a minute, actually these young women, in my particular research, these women are actually saying something, really have something to say, are taking risks that other artists can't. For example, you know, J-Lo's performance, I don't think a lot of people could have got away with what she did, especially against the NFL at the, you know, and it comes down to the wire, to the last minute. So that the glamour, they do embody, they do carry a certain type of, unpredictability, but power and difficulty of controlling them. And therefore difficulty censoring them. So that's what one of my research sort of does. I think why I think it's important is that we, rather than looking at glamour as some sort of material cultural phenomenon or pattern of consumption, right? We consume certain products. But if we look at it as a type of performance, as embodied culture, as repertoire, I think that's where we start to see more politically activated things. And like I said, not always for good, not always for good. And say, you know, glamour, there's other things too, right? Like the feminists, I came from a feminist perspective. The feminists are very, very, very divided on the value of glamour. I come out on the positive end, but yeah, I think understanding it, and I think there's a certain dismissal of glamour, you know, of glamour as not a medium of protest, but I think it's a very significant one because of its audience, because of the ability it has, you know, that yes, we can glamorize something like immigrant child detention at the border, and we can put it on stage for audiences of over 300 million people. And I'm sure the global viewership of that performance, I'm sure, I would say over 1 billion people have seen it.
The performance itself attracts the attention to unusual ways that the glamour does that. If you think about Feeman's Naked Jihad, you know, it's glamorous, but they took all their clothes off. It's glamorous without the attire, right? I mean, much of controversy around Naked Jihad, but
there's some really fun intersections between like glamour and fashion and protest. So, for example, you know, one of the objects that recently came up was the pussy hats. You know, also the slut walks. Slut walks are so fabulous, where we all, you know, we dress as sluts and we protest police. I think it was a comment by the TPS saying that, well, if women didn't dress like sluts, they wouldn't get raped. And so the use of glamour as sort of like a resilient front, almost like this reflective mirror, this reflective surface that shows you back yourself. Yeah.
Adam.
Thanks, Ada and Tanya and Karyn, for really cool constellation of cultures of protest. I really loved all the talks. But I just want to ask Tanya. So, like, it's super interesting that the halftime or the Super Bowl is just, I guess, interesting. I'm not interested in football or halftime shows or commercials, but lots of people are, and they tend to identify themselves as like, oh, I only watch the Super Bowl for the commercials, or I only watch it for the halftime show or something, right? And so I just wonder, how it's interesting how there's three just distinct groups that identify themselves as, I don't care about the other thing. And like, in fact, like I couldn't care less about the other thing, right? Yeah. And then so, like, I wonder how that kind of, whether you found any result or like interesting like ways of gauging that, considering like the cliche that we're so divided now, or that everyone's polarized or something. Like is there any evidence that someone who watches a football game watches the J-Lo thing, or that is even like globally, like when you're saying globally, like, I mean, well, the rest of the world has never really not been quick to be against or American imperialism or whatever, right? So is there kind of, have you looked at, I don't know, can you say more about sort of the weird kind of mashup of those things that how they might not, they might not hold attention from one genres than others.
So I kind of understand what you're saying. There's sort of like three distinct lenses, like those who are there for the football, those who are there for the ads, and those who are there for the show.
Yeah, and is anybody watching, like anyone who's clearly not interested in the other thing, like are they watching that thing? Like is Donald Trump watching J-Lo, like, because he wasn't at that Super Bowl, right? So like, is he watching that? Do you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
But not him, but
Yeah,
I just mean, are conservatives watching
Yeah.
Kendrick Lamar?
I come from a background of performance studies, so I'll talk about the performances themselves. I'm not a sociologist, but okay. So I mean, first off, the very interesting thing is that the viewership for the halftime show surpasses the viewership for the game.
Right.
So there's this moment, this 15-minute space between, I don't know, Act 1 and Act 2 of the football game. I don't know. There's this extreme spectacle that more people will actually tune in for that than they will for the game itself. In terms of the stage, the halftime show is such a it's such a place of ideological clash, because you sort of have this generally kind of politically, I characterize them as anywhere from disinterested to very Republican conservative leaning football spectatorship. It can depend on which city the game is held in. This performance, I didn't mention it in my presentation, but it's held in Miami. And actually, the first thing that Shakira does when she comes on the stage, she says, "Hola Miami," and then doesn't greet the crowd in English. But okay, so it can the clash. So I can talk about the clash in terms of I think really starting from Janet Jackson and every single one since has been about there's this broad. In media and interviews and reviews of the performance that really, really commend the performer on their performance. They really commend them for their values, for sharing their feeling, their politics, their protests. But then, of course, there's also thousands and thousands of complaints filed to the FCC every single year. There's all kinds of if you tune into news organizations like Fox News following these presentations. I mean, it's just the most denigrating things I've ever heard. Some of the most misogynistic things I've ever heard. Some of the most racist things I've ever heard get said about these performers in conservative news outlets. So it's like every single halftime show is just such a flashpoint, such a head, and then it kind of makes me wonder. I'm like, well, why do they do that? Why do they continue to put artists that conflict with the fandom of NFL. And interesting. And then there's this really complicated. We could kind of get into some of the capitalism behind it, because Jay-Z's company Rock Nation has this really complicated contract for the halftime stage. And Jay-Z is sort of, his mentality is, you don't tell me what to do. I'll do the show that I want, or I'll program the show that I want, which gives Jay-Z an amount of power that maybe we should question him having. But yeah, so for me, the stage, I can't speak necessarily to why someone is the football game, why someone tunes in for the ads at a halftime show, but I can say the halftime show is such a stage of clash, and I mean mass scale clash. Yeah, and I think just for us in this room, just watching the Kendrick Lamar performance last, Kendrick Lamar can go on TV and call Drake a pedophile in front of hundreds of millions of people. All these protests that you have planned, you can do those too. They're absolutely, let the halftime show embolden you. Yeah, let yourself be emboldened by it. Yeah.
Thank you for these papers. They're fantastic papers, and it got me thinking about a kind of sort of an underlying kind of problematic that the three papers kind of bring together. And I'll try to sort of, what I want to do is offer you an invitation to speak about this what I started to sort of think about as I was listening to these papers, to your own reflections about what you think about this. So one aspect of it has to do with the kind of the way in which we as scholars and academics and knowledge producers and experts are undergoing this process of becoming Bartleby, right? In the context of the Waffen at SS University, which is a systemic thing. I mean, it's particularly Waffen here at the UA, but it's, this is happening in many places in other kinds of ways, right? And it makes me think about, I've been thinking about this a lot in terms of the stories that we used to hear about the Soviet Union how people would just sort of go through the motions of what they were supposed to be doing and so on and so forth, but nobody believed in the cause anymore, nobody believed in anything. And it seems to me increasingly that for certain kinds of bureaucratized and institutionalized forms of politics that the liberal democratic world has created for itself, that's what's happening to us in that kind of way, right? And you think about this in terms of your paper, Aidan. I mean, you know, from Foucault. I mean, I guess one could trace this back further in other kinds of work as well. But certainly Foucault is a kind of major reference point in terms of this, in terms of helping us understand the crises of expertise. That is a huge political crisis that's happening in the present moment and so on. In terms of the question of fascism and lots and lots of people who have no faith in experts in any kind of way whatsoever, and the specific issues you're dealing with kind of intersect with that in a particular kind of way, right? And I guess the specific question for you in that respect would be, you know, the recent things about medications used for gender reassignment processes and so on. I don't know if you follow the story about the issue in the UK and then the debates that have been happening. And I turned to that in particular because of your location in public health. I thought that there might be some kind of interesting debate going on there that you want to talk about in that regard. And then I really loved your paper, and I found it very helpful in terms of thinking about glamour in particular. I'm one of the 3 people in the world that didn't see the J.Lo show. We're all here. We're all here.
I don't watch whatever that is.
Okay, 4 people.
We're not proud of it either.
So thank you very much for that. And I guess the question I'm trying to, the problematic I'm trying to formulate here is in this respect, is that our situation as producers, as experts and producers of knowledge and so on and so forth, is that if there is to be an anti-fascist politics, and if there is to be if there's to be an anti-fascist politics, there has to be an anti-fascist popular culture, right? And the paradox is for us, and this is only a paradox for us, is that there's no way that as experts, as university professors and so on, that one can in any direct way socially engineer popular culture. And by definition, in a certain kind of way is what I want to put there on the table for us. Which then leaves us in a very interesting kind of speculative mode of operations in terms of trying to think about how could an anti-fascist popular culture thrive in the context of a very fascist popular culture in that kind of way. And this is where your talk in particular I found very provocative, because one of the things about, I mean, the Super Bowl is an example par excellence of the spectacularization of the market, right? This is, the market operates both as a site of capitalist accumulation, but at the same time, it's a show. The market is a show in that kind of way. And it's, you know, one of the things about the J.Lo performance is that it really demonstrates that kind of necessary double-pronged dialectic between mass culture and popular culture, and the utopianism of that dialectic in that kind of way as well, right? That of course J.Lo is going to take that moment and try to turn it around in some kind of way. And so just to have you reflect more about that, and you know, in terms of that relationship between expertise, mass culture, popular culture, I think is something that's a really kind of interesting set of issues that your papers altogether bring together in that kind of way, right? And also the gendering of it. You know, we're talking about different audiences that watch different parts of the show.
Yeah.
My guess would be more women watch the halftime show and guys only watch the football game.
I think one of the things that glamour, you know, these shows really teach us is the power of winning the crowd, of having the power to enchant the crowd. And I I mean, I don't know, the old film Gladiator is sort of running from win the crowd, and you win power over the emperor. You know, so and like I said, you know, you and that's such, and what a power it is to have the crowd behind you. And sometimes, yeah, it's not always a power that produces good, but it is this incredible source of authority and status to have, and it's dangerous. It's a dangerous position. Think about someone like Shakespeare, who had the power of the crowd, but that also put him in a very dangerous position with the monarchy and the dynastic shift that he had to experience in his life. So just the methods, the performative methods that we use, the performances that win us over. We could be very cognizant of why we're drawn to what we're drawn to.
The fact that we are being told to do various things and being policed in various ways, and that it creates a certain kind of affective economy, which is, you know, can often be very toxic, means that we have the option of sometimes at least stepping back and saying, I don't want to engage in that behavior. I don't want to bully my colleague. I don't want to use this tone of voice with a graduate student or undergraduate student, right? So taking the meta perspective, you know, thinking the standpoint of political economy, and understanding how our labor is being defined by neoliberal norms, or redefined for some of us who are old, means that we can actually take, you know, not engage in those behaviors when it's possible, and thereby, you know, at least try to counter or not reproduce certain kinds of toxicity. Because many of our students are, you know, mentally ill in various ways, increasingly they have serious anxiety problems, and graduate students in particular have, you know, a lot of problems getting their work done and you know, finishing, and so I think that those should be understood as symptoms of the moment. It's not that people are necessarily that everybody was crazy and they just didn't talk about it before. But I think the conditions that we're living in, you know, that include the high cost of housing, but also the kind of learned helplessness that develops when city and provincial governments or federal governments don't do anything to solve any problems that they create, or they buy, you know, Tylenol for $5,000 a bottle, but don't clear the roads, right? So, you know, this is you know, we can choose to reproduce these norms or not in certain situations. So I think trying not to reproduce them is a good idea, but also teaching our students about neoliberalism and how poisonous it is important, because I know that when I've taught about it in my classes, students actually kind of recognize their lives in the descriptions about like the kind of alienations or stresses that they feel. And that might be useful to them at some point in their life, or give them a little bit of solace.
I think in terms of questions posed about the crisis of expertise, you know, on the one hand, it is worrying to see so much public distrust on experts. But on the other hand, I think there has to be a level of discomfort we have to face with that and sit with, because, you know, in the context of like the madness movement, critiquing experts was the kind of mode of resistance. Madness activism calls into question the very basis of psychiatry and psychology as a discipline. Some people don't believe in that anymore. Some people that are part of the madness movement don't subscribe to full anti-psychiatry anymore, but many still do, and that in itself becomes kind of a way of generating knowledge. And so I think one of the better responses that we can have is the only word that's coming to mind right now is like approaching it with humility and kind of coming to an understanding that the institutions that generate experts are also institutions that do generate harm. Academia being one of them. And being willing to have that kind of reckoning and figuring out moving from there without having to, necessarily throw away the entire system, because that's pretty impossible right now. I'm thinking, as an example of this, Bell Hooks, her philosophy of writing was, if I can't explain my theoretical work, my research, to somebody who is illiterate, who has never been able to read before, then my theory and research is useless. And I'm like reading through my notes now, and I'm seeing just how few words would be understandable to somebody who can't read above a 6th grade level, to youth. So how do we translate our expertise in a way that's understandable to a wider audience on their terms and on their levels? And for whatever reason, what's also coming to mind is, control of media, because those kinds of ideas, those anti-expertise ideas, are transmuted, I don't know what the term is, across mass media, across pop culture, and the people who have the money to decide what goes into mass media, which are generally Republicans, and American interest groups, kind of get to decide the terms on which we can have our discourses. Pulling from the halftime show, the Kendrick Lamar halftime show, how quickly that one of his dancers pulled out in protest the Palestine and Sudan flags, and just how quickly that was reacted to on air, how quick that response was to censor that protest. Protest within a protest that may or may not have been worked and coordinated with Kendrick Lamar. I'm not sure. I've seen some conflicting accounts. So how do we translate our ideas through a media that is increasingly hostile to us? And that's I think an ongoing.
It seems to me that what your paper really does is, because expertise is at its most dangerous when it believes itself to be apolitical, right? And what your paper is doing is politicizing expertise in a very important kind of way, right? So I thought, yeah, you're making a lot of sense. Any other questions, observations? If not, lunch is here and it's in the next room.